Doom 3D is one of the most important games ever published. Released in late 1993, the game featured an ingenious new game engine that overcame various hardware restrictions of the day. It was created in a messy and unorganized mid-sized studio in Dallas. Home footage reveals a work environment that is more like a home. As family members wander through the studio, conference rooms are rigged for sound engineering, and offices are stacked with soda, CDs, and computers. We see lead designer John Romero playing through a newly published game and walking through a beta version of Doom, while others watch and commentate. The home footage of this messy office space captures a crucial moment in the history of gaming, one where a video game studio was more akin to a home, one that housed the early incantation of a billion-dollar industry. The events that lead to Doom's publication are ones that took place in the 1980s. Scholars have not coherently investigated the game industry in the 1980s or its implications for the future. My project seeks to connect the various happenings in the game industry during this decade as a means to understand the publication of Doom. My thesis rests on three interconnected arguments. First, the coin-op system was a vital component to the video game industry's crash in 1983 and a driving force for developers to either fight for increased creative rights or pushing them to the home computer space. Simply, the coin-op system was one where a game would be released for an arcade system and depending on how well it sold, would be ported for a home console. The idea was to develop a game as simply and as quickly as possible. Second, the video game crash of 1983 was a crash in the American home console market, while the home computing market was seeing a steady rise. Developers in this space saw more creative freedom because they were not restricted by the coin-op model, and it remained a fairly niche category. As the price of home computers fell, home computer games were becoming a more viable means for consumers. Third, historians have understood the 1980s as one that was dominated by the battle between Sega and Nintendo. I argue that while they certainly competed, we should not exacerbate the extent to which Sega contributed to the rebirth of the home console market. This was mostly due to Nintendo. In addition, we should pay more attention to how violence in video games was becoming a crucial topic of debate within the video game industry, but was undeniably driving video game technology further. Both my thesis and chronological scope are based in a small group of scholars who have devoted attention to the industry. There are arguably only 3 complete books on the video game industry in the 1980s, all of which are case studies into a particular event or company. There are no comprehensive articles or books regarding the industry in this time. In contrast, more attention has been devoted to the history of the arcade era, but these have been dominated by Golden Age theses and approaches that understand the period through the lens of important games. One of the case studies mentioned above is Blake J. Harris' Console Wars, which is an in-depth analysis of the corporate competition between Sega and Nintendo. While its scope is narrow, it was an important methodological and structural guide for this project. Similar to Console Wars, David Kushner's Masters of Doom tracks the early history of ID Software through John Carmack and John Romero. Kushner uses the lives of these two figures to understand the publications of Doom and the brief history of ID Software. While each of these works have valuable components, what is notable is that they focus on specific games or specific figures, lacking strong connection between historical events and missing out on the mid-part of the century. While many scholars believe that the 1970s and early 80s were a golden age for the arcade, it was all but clear that the home console was a dominant force in the game industry. The Atari 2600 was released in 1977 as a landmark console for its improvements in hardware and Atari's marketing strategy. The console sold around 30 million units, leveling a massive ad campaign through a partnership with Warner Bros. Chris Crawford worked at Atari during this time and gives more insight into how the industry was in the late 70s and early 80s. Crawford recalls great fears within the company regarding the instability of the coin-op model and the rapid success of the new console. Again, the coin-op system meant that a game would be tested in the arcade arena, and if it found success, Atari would invest in creating a port for their home console. The American home console market crashed in the winter of 1983, driving the industry into a recession. The dominant explanation for the crash is that the market became oversaturated and the game E.T.'s massive flop lost consumer interest. This explanation is half-hearted, as my research indicates that the coin-op model was responsible for the oversaturation in the market and was restricting creativity among development teams. The crash of '83 was not so much that there was too many games, but that there were too many poorly made video games as a result of stringent restrictions on developers' freedom. Properly framing the crash of '83 is vital for our understanding of the restoration of the American home console market. And so out of the industry's death was a new foundation that was manifesting through Nintendo and the home computer. First, Nintendo bought out the license of many of the games that had failed during the crash, arguably giving them a monopoly in the American game market in the late 80s and early 90s. Also important is Nintendo's devotion to quality within their games, which is in stark contrast to the status quo during the industry's failure. While Nintendo's presence wouldn't be felt until 1986 or 1987, their investment in the mid-part of the decade is crucial. Further overlooked is the home computer, which was seeing stable growth out of the video game crash in 1983. A 1983 news article notes that the home computer was the fastest growing part of the consumer electronic field. The article goes on to assert that computer games were given their own space at the 1983 Consumer Electronics Show in Chicago. By 1984, the magazine Computer Game World was popular enough to where they had their own conference. At this conference, leaders in the home computer game space discussed how competition between home computer companies was improving technology while driving prices down. The archives of Computer Game World give many insights into how the industry was different than previous home console industries, as developers have far more freedom and competition between companies was strong. For those who are skeptical, estimations of computer sales for the C64 in the mid-1980s mirror that of Atari VCS sales in 1977. While it is unclear how many people use these devices for games, the growth of magazines like Computer Game World and reflections from figures in the industry indicate that it was seeing a steady growth and great potential as computer prices fell. As the decade came to a close, it was clear that computer games were growing and had a promising future, but it was Nintendo that exploded onto the market with a near monopoly in the United States. Multiple ABC segments were released during the late 80s that described controversy surrounding Nintendo's dominance in the United States. As mentioned previously, the book Console Wars is the foremost work on video games in this period, posing Sega as a significant competitor to Nintendo. One of the segments mentioned above goes into deep detail into Nintendo's legal battles and suppression of other competing companies. Interestingly, this segment does not mention Sega once as a strong competitor. In addition, Sega's best console sales do not come within millions of Nintendo's within the same year. These two sources are in addition to a slew of others that indicate that Harris may have exacerbated Sega's role in the late 80s and early 90s. The point is not that they did not compete, rather that Sega did not play as large of a role as Harris suggests, and that Nintendo was the vital player in the rebirth of the American home console market. Furthermore, violence may have been a more important topic to American consumers than the competition between Nintendo and Sega. Article and magazine entries from writers and developers of the time indicate that action-based games were crucial for driving innovation within video game engines. Magazine covers from Computer Game World almost always feature action/violence-oriented games. By 1993, even Nintendo Power magazine had embraced action games on the majority of their covers. As such, the late 80s and early 90s should be understood as a direct transition from the great video game crash in 1983 through Nintendo and computer games and violence. My project ends with the publication of Doom. Doom is emblematic of the great change that took place during the 1980s, as its development team was a group of young and talented computer programmers who were social outcasts. They left stable jobs in a mid-sized game studio to program their games in a messy office devoted to making the ones that they wanted to play. John Romero and John Carmack were both incredibly talented, but felt othered from society and their families, only to find a space within the computer game industry. Their games were the most violent of the time, emblematic of so much of what people feared in the early 90s. The action in these games pushed Carmack to develop the most innovative and important game engine of the day, while driving more creative artwork, level design, and audio engineering. As one of the most important games of all time, Doom can only be understood by tracing the events of the 1980s. Without the coin-op system and the great video game crash, the home computer space may never develop its unique designer culture. Perhaps we never get Doom, and so on.